Hello and welcome to the 14th episode of Global Pause Rethink the Future, a podcast for those that are looking at our way of life and are pondering whether or not we can overcome the civilizational impasse as exemplified through consumerism. So we are all market orientated. This is our plot. This is the model of life. I suppose it's been set up for ourselves. So I'm just looking at engaging in our context to uncover the ultimate cause of the impasse that we essentially are facing off with, and then charting a way out of that holding pattern. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at money in greater detail and looking at the overcoming of the use of money, but essentially looking at what it conceals and how the praxis ultimately that we're advocating is dealing with, overcoming the convention of money to ennoble human action, and obviously by ennobling human action we ennoble ourselves. So that's essentially what we're going to be covering off today. So we take the use of money as a given. So in the context of our way of life, what's really important to consider, say compared to, say, other previous historical epochs, is that we are market orientated. So in order to really understand the nature of money in the context that we're looking at from, we have to understand what it means to be market orientated. So to be market orientated is not just to be orientated towards our wants as an end in itself. So the market is there to obviously to provide the means of us to satisfy, the wants that we have for ourselves that we have. Because if you consider, and we've touched upon this in prior episodes, that every exchange, what we consider to be an interpersonal exchange, is underwritten by the good of your time. So if it's underwritten by the good of your time, irrespective of whether or not you satisfy the want, your being in the market is really not to satisfy a want, but is to satisfy the need of economising your time independent of that satisfaction. So the dividend, in inverted commas, that you really are getting through being market orientated is the time that you secure for yourself. Obviously, you disburden yourself from having to procure or make whatever it is that you are buying, and so you can just go and get it. So obviously capital formation just removes time waiting, but that's a given. So you don't give it. The issue here is that we don't give it the due consideration that we do when we go down the street and just buy something, because it's given. It's not. We don't reflect upon it to the degree that we're looking at the significance of that orientation. So when we are saying that we are market orientated, ultimately we're orientated towards our time. That's the preeminent good that we're securing for ourselves. But in the context of being market orientated, we secure our time as an economic good. Because it's completely different to say back, it could be hundreds of years where the market didn't predominate as a way of life or as a model for a way of life. So let's say in the context of maybe the rich, there was a richer religious life or communal life or spiritual life. And so therefore the market, as far as it's the securing of maybe necessities, was really limited in its scope. But the market has become all-encompassing. And the reason why, and it really don't have to understand the nature of the way how this has come about, we can just accept it for what it is now, because this is ultimately, we're dealing with what we are facing as far as possibilities that are open for ourselves. But then the reason why it's important is to consider that when we are market orientated, which means to say that we are orientated towards our time as an economic good, we are ultimately orientated towards money, because money is the means to secure our temporality, in the sense that we are accumulating a stock of money which equates to a stock of time, and then depending obviously on on how much the style or the lifestyle that you emulate will determine, a budget constraint that you're working against in order to style that supplement. But that's essentially what it is. So the denominator here is the use of money. But what we have to consider in that, the world that we accept for ourselves or that we've been placed into, and if we are to question it in a way that we can open up possibility that's not necessarily overt or considered as such because of our orientation of being beholden to the orientation. So what we need to consider is that our orientation, when we are orientated to being market orientated, we are orientated towards exchanges, but not the secondary exchanges of want satisfaction, so going down and buying something, but the primary exchange, which is obviously the preeminent good of our time. Now, when you consider it in the scenario which I've just laid out there, where is that there is no market for your time other than obviously your own temporality. It's a conscious thing. It's about the nature of our temporality is really what we're dealing with. So the reason why it's important to consider the nature of orientation is that we are orientating ourselves towards our temporality and the way how we experience life. Now, when you're looking at what is open for ourselves, so you have to consider that is that orientation open or is it closed? And what does being orientated towards our time and through the medium of money actually conceals? So let's think about the nature of that for a little bit. So, because if it's closed in the sense that you're orientated towards your time as a preeminent good, well, let's think what is a good that's greater than your time? And it's your legacy. Everybody knows it's a legacy. We take our time as being a given, but then ultimately we know that there's a legacy to our actions. But if you think, so let's think of the way how this works in the scenario of understanding being market orientated, being orientated towards your wants. So there's a legacy to your actions. So if you go down the street and you buy something and you don't give due consideration to the externalities that have been created for the purpose of providing that good. So there's a legacy to your actions there that you conceal, not that you conceal from yourself intentionally, but because you're beholden to your time as a preeminent good, you obscure the view to the full scope of your actions. Now, the context here is if economics frames our actions as being purposeful and only orientated towards the alleviation of dis-ease or the removal of want, but then doesn't give due consideration to the wider ramifications of our actions and how it creates the world, then that's essentially the orientation as a sense as far as your understanding of what motivates your action is extremely impoverishing, because it doesn't give full scope to the agency that is basically latent there. And one of the things that we have to consider is that if you're considering money as a given, then you're not considering the nature of the agency or the creativity that you have to create the world beyond the givenness of that institution. So a question that I could pose to ourselves is whether or not we feel that we can surpass money. Now, a lot of people just think it's absolutely impossible because of just the nature of what it is. But this is more a reflection of our culture more than anything. So if we're looking at what's open to ourselves, what we're doing is we're looking at a way how what is essentially closed to us as a way has to be opened in a way to remove a holding pattern and so therefore ennoble our actions beyond the current way how we tend to kind of understand our purposeful action. So people can say that they're orientated towards a life, but if they say lifestyle is different to life. Right? This is the one thing that we have to bear in mind. There might be an equivocation, but there is a world of difference. So let's understand the nature of why that's the case. So if you understand that you are orientated towards lifestyle and you accept money as a given, well, then you're passing over the way of the world, the way how the world is given now. So this is looking at all the institutions basically that are managing things on your behalf, because you accept the orientation of your time as being the preeminent good, and then obviously the medium of money. All right, so when you're saying that you are orientated towards life, but you're orientated towards a lifestyle, the equivocation cannot be substantiated. Because once again, if we looked at, okay, to be orientated towards life, what does that mean? Now, let's say that if you are orientated towards life, you are orientated towards life as in, do you accept givens? Or if we're looking at what is open to us now to create the grounds of a world where life would flourish, there's a qualitative difference between the orientation that would then differentiate between lifestyle and what would constitute life in that regards. Because then what you're doing is you're not passing over the agency left fallow for accepting money as a given. Because once again, to be orientated towards our time as a preeminent good is really being orientated towards our understanding of our temporality. And if we understand our temporality in the sense that we secure our time as a supplement or as an economic good, then are you really relating to your temporality primordially in the sense as the way how we would define it as far as life goes? And the answer would be no. No, it's not. Why? Because we are market orientated. We are orientated towards our time. But once again, the good that is greater than your time is a legacy of your actions. And your actions are inherently creative. So if we're questioning our actions, we're questioning the creative scope of our actions beyond your acceptance or your receptivity of their impoverishment, where they're orientated towards economising actions and the supposed well-being that you are pursuing. Because once again, if there are certain givens that you pass over, then there's certain diseases of our way of life that you accept as a given as well. So if you are individualising your pursuit to remove dis-ease without giving due consideration to what you pass over and the diseases that you accept, like the externalities of pollution, the externality of people, because you are orientating towards your time, then you are not giving due consideration to the creative scope that lies fallow. So when we're looking at money, in the scenario that we're talking about, you're looking at the way how you can animate creativity that is latent and ultimately release a lot of the goods, in inverted commas, that money conceals, that are civilizational forces that can animate basically the creation of the world or animate a culture and ultimately animate ourselves beyond the self that we accept when we accept ourselves as being market orientated, as being orientating ourselves towards our time as a preeminent good. And this has a lot to do with the nature of the goodwill that you animate. This has, if we work back to the way how business, have a go-to market strategy. So by default, they place people in a market and they accept money as a given. So therefore, they accept your agency without question as being reduced into buying and selling. There is a tacit acknowledgement of the orientation when businesses are focused or consider you as much. And so this is one of the things that has to be considered when you're looking at the nature of goodwill, in the sense that this is presupposed. You have goodwill as far as the orientation towards that reduction. So it presupposes that. Because if you think the orientation has got to do with loyalty, there's if you don't question the orientation, then to a certain degree what you're saying or substantiating is that you have loyalty to that way of life or that understanding of a way of life of being market orientated. You're loyal to that paradigm. So when we're questioning the use of when we're questioning not only the orientation but the use of money, we're questioning our loyalty that would otherwise be monetized, because that's what business wants to do. It wants to monetize your goodwill, and goodwill is an intangible, and intangibles can be put on balance sheets. So when you're looking at the way how you are going to surpass all right, or you're going to ennoble human action, you are very much looking at the way how goodwill is monetized and is put on a balance sheet. It can't be put on a balance sheet, because if it's not put on a balance sheet, what is that saying to you? It's saying to you that where business would position themselves in the market, and so therefore define their culture as being an asset, and that asset is utilised in order to monetize your goodwill, if they are partaking in a culture that is beyond their organisation, as it were, so they partake in a culture that is collective, it's a cooperative ethos, then how can they monetize that goodwill when it's animating the culture that is beyond the asset that they take goodwill for, or culture for, I should say? So there's a critical difference. It's there's nothing fluffy about the way how we're approaching change in the context of being market orientated, because you are literally looking at, if you're removing money from the interaction and as a result of that, engendering a different way of giving and receiving, and we're removing money as a fulcrum point, then ultimately you are literally removing money. You're removing money from a balance sheet. You're removing money from as being a medium here, because if you're removing it as a median, you're removing the mediation of not only of between people but yourself. Getting back to the nature of the orientation and the understanding of our temporality is absolutely the only thing that we have to deal with here. It's got nothing else other than that. That is the main focus in this whole praxis, is understanding our temporality and the way how we can be orientated towards life, where we can experience it unmediated. All right, and that culture is the security. That culture is the one that disburdens yourself from the anxiety and feeling that you're beholden to powers removed from yourself. Can't stress this enough. It's so self-empowering. But once again, it comes down to the nature of what we can put into play when we are all orientated towards that. And it only comes through essentially taking the impoverishment of your action as far as the economization of action that we take our actions for, and ennobling that action to a greater good. And the greater good, what is that good that is greater than your time? It's the legacy of your actions. So if we put it in context of what we are going to bequeath to future generations, what are we orientated towards in our actions? If we are going to ennoble our actions now, we're doing that because what we're putting into play is a legacy of our actions that is essentially going to diverge from the current paradigm, the way how the orientation that we accept for ourselves. That's a legacy that we're focusing on, and the way how that is achieved is through through releasing the goodwill that essentially I've kind of dealt with now. So I think I'll leave it at that. Just to frame it, like, once again, we're looking at the way how you're engendering a different praxis. So looking at cynicism, looking at apathy, looking at engendering goodwill, and looking at trust. Because if you think the nature of money, all the institutions that lay claim to that trust, they don't demonstrate it. It gets abused. It's never put into play. It's not dynamic. It's taken as a given, but we disempower ourselves, and it doesn't matter whichever way, whichever form of money that you utilise, you're not demonstrating a culture that would surpass the use. So you're never demonstrating or putting into play the goodwill that it conceals. And that goodwill is absolutely critical in order to lift ourselves beyond the holding pattern that we accept for ourselves. So until next time, anyway, take care.